Hello, Sunday School teachers, preachers, and students. Welcome to SundaySchoolPreacher.com. In this week's lesson, Solomon speaks to the people in the midst of a worship experience. Solomon's speech reminds them of his father King David's heart. He reminds them that it was his father's heart's desire to build a house for the Lord God of Israel. God may have made the covenant with King David, but it would be King Solomon that would build the temple and secure a permanent place for God to dwell. Even though all of this took many years, God keeps God's promises and God honors God's covenants. In this worship experience, Solomon honors God. He acknowledges his father and he blesses or salutes the people. God had occupied the temple in the presence of a thick cloud, and now the dedication can proceed. Some of the ideas surrounding this week's text include the terms omnipresence and First Temple period. Wherever you are in the world, thank you for subscribing to this channel. I love to hear your thoughts on the lesson in the comments below. If you subscribe to this channel and click the notifications bell, you'll be notified as soon as I upload next week's lesson. Plus, that lets YouTube know that you like this channel and they'll promote it more. And if you have Wi-Fi in your church Sunday school classroom, this channel is a good way to teach and discuss this week's lesson. I provide a concise overview of background, context, characters, themes, and topics that gets to the point, saves you time, and enhances your own teaching and study. If that's what you're looking for, you're in the right place. But the only way I know this is helpful is if you subscribe, click the like button, or say so in the comments. And if you want to support this channel, I accept correspondence and gifts at 1590 Jonesboro Road Southeast, Box 150032, Atlanta, Georgia 30315. So with that said, welcome again to SundaySchoolPreacher.com, and let's go to work. As always, we begin with the background for today's text. This week's lesson begins where last week's lesson ended. The 4 lessons of Unit 2 are focused on dedicating the temple of God. Each of these 4 lessons come from 1 Kings, the 8th chapter. So in this week's background, I'll highlight some of the broad background of Kings and then focus more specifically on the history of the temple. I mentioned last week how the New Interpreter Study Bible explains that Kings covers almost 400 years of Israel's history, from the ascension of Solomon to the throne before the death of David to the fall of Jerusalem in 587 before Common Era. This book, containing almost 400 years of history, has several editions. The NISB notes that Kings was composed in different stages. The first edition was finished in the pre-exilic time, that's the time before the exile, probably before the death of Josiah. A second edition was written when the Jews were in exile around 550 years before Common Era, a few years after the release of Jehoiakim. And you can check 2 Kings, the 25th chapter, verses 27 through 30. The NISB also notes, as a historical book, 1 Kings is a theological interpretation of the monarchy and of the kings of Israel and Judah until the reign of Ahaziah. The book describes the kingdom under Solomon and gives the religious reasons for the division of the united monarchy. Check 1 Kings, the 11th chapter, verses 1 through 13. So you probably remember that King David united the kingdoms of Judah and Israel, but under the reign of Solomon's son, Rehoboam, the united kingdom would divide. The writers of Kings provide theological reasons for why the kingdom divided. For example, every king in the northern kingdom allowed the religious innovation of Jeroboam to remain, and as a result, each was judged as having done what was evil. In other words, the kings in the northern kingdom of Israel did not follow the ways of God like the kings in the southern kingdom of Judah. And for the writers of Kings, this explains their continuous downfall and evilness. Since this Unit 2 is focused on dedicating the temple, I'll provide a brief history of God's dwelling place also. In Exodus, the 25th chapter, verse 8, God tells Moses, "Have them make me a sanctuary, so that I may dwell among them." Moses built a tabernacle or a tent. The NISB notes, the plans for the tabernacle were a pattern of the Lord's heavenly home. Construction of the tabernacle allowed the Lord, listen, to descend to earth. Thus it connects heaven and earth. So the tabernacle was a temporary home for the presence of God and was a connection point between God's heavenly abode and earth. Moses built the temporary tabernacle, and about 500 years later, King Solomon would dedicate a newly built permanent temple to God. This temple is known as the First Temple. Dr. Stephen Breck Reed notes in the Africana Bible, Reading Israel's Scriptures from Africa and the African Diaspora, when the northern kingdom Israel split off, it developed its own temple. That would have been 922 before Common Era. When the colonial Persian Judean regime wanted to consolidate their power, they refurbished the temple, and that would have been 515 years before Common Era. Now, what Dr. Reed calls the colonial Persian Judean regime is when Zerubbabel returned with the exiles and rebuilt the first temple. Zerubbabel's rebuilt temple marks the beginning of the Second Temple period, and that lasted until 70 Common Era. Dr. Reed continues, through poor intelligence, the Seleucids believed that they could transform the temple into a Greek Hellenistic temple without any political consequences, and this would have been 168 years before Common Era. Herod the Great again consolidated his power with the people through an extensive expansion of the temple, and that was in 20 Common Era, and this would have been during the time of Jesus Christ. And then finally, the Roman general Titus has his army sack the temple in 70 Common Era. So over time, the place for God to dwell transitioned from the tabernacle that Moses built to the temple that Solomon built. The temple that Solomon built would eventually be destroyed, and the place for God to dwell would transition to every believer in Jesus Christ. 1 Corinthians, the 3rd chapter, 16th verse reminds us, "Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you?" In Acts, the 7th chapter, before Stephen was stoned to death, he reminded his persecutors, our ancestors had the tent of testimony. He's talking about the tabernacle. Our ancestors had the tent of testimony in the wilderness as God directed when he spoke to Moses, ordering him to make it according to the pattern he had seen. Our ancestors in turn brought it in with Joshua when they dispossessed the nations that God drove out before our ancestors. And it was there until the time of David. Stephen is talking about the tabernacle, who found favor with God and asked that he might find a dwelling place for the house of Jacob. But it was Solomon who built a house for him. Listen, yet the Most High, this is Stephen talking, the Most High does not dwell in houses made with human hands. And that's Stephen's record before he's stoned to death, reminding us that now God does not dwell in houses made with human hands. God is omnipresent, and God dwells within every believer in Jesus Christ. Our focus last week was how King Solomon brought the Ark of the Covenant from Zion to the newly built temple. This week, Solomon speaks to the people as he continues the dedication of this newly built temple. Some important words to consider from this text include omnipresent and first temple, period. So the review of last week and how it connects to this week. In last week's lesson, Solomon finally had a place for the ark. Solomon summoned the ark from Zion to the newly built temple in Jerusalem. Cherubim and the Shekinah glory of God were highlighted in the text as the nation of Israel participated in the dedication of the new temple. It was about 40 years earlier when King David dreamed of a great temple for God's permanent dwelling place. David had the dream, but his son Solomon fulfilled the dream. The Hebrew people had worshipped at the non-permanent tabernacle for about 500 years. Now, the elders, the heads of the tribes, and the leaders of the ancestral houses would lead the procession and dedication of this magnificent new permanent temple. The tabernacle was the symbol of God's presence among the Israelites. Now that symbol would be the temple. The temple would become the national sanctuary. Last week, Solomon had a place for the permanent temple. This week, he speaks to the people as he dedicates what God had provided for God's own dwelling place according to God's promise. Solomon recognizes the role God plays in making this dedication possible, and he recognizes the people of God who were the hands and feet God used. Townsend and Boyd's commentary titled this week's lesson, Solomon's Speech. Standard Lesson commentary titles this week's lesson, Solomon Speaks to the People. The scripture text comes from 1 Kings, the 8th chapter, verses 14 through 21. I'll read that text for you now from the New Revised Standard Version. We begin with a section entitled Solomon's Speech. Then the king turned around and blessed all the assembly of Israel, while all the assembly of Israel stood. He said, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who with his hands has fulfilled what he promised with his mouth to my father David, saying, Since the day that I brought my people Israel out of Egypt, I have not chosen a city from any of the tribes of Israel in which to build a house, that my name might be there. But I chose David to be over my people Israel. My father David had it in his mind to build a house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. But the Lord said to my father David, You did well to consider building a house for my name. Nevertheless, you shall not build the house, but your son, who shall be born to you, shall build the house for my name. Now the Lord has upheld the promise that he made. For I have risen in the place of my father David. I sit on the throne of Israel as the Lord promised, and have built the house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. There I have provided a place for the ark, in which is the covenant of the Lord that he made with our ancestors when he brought them out of the land of Egypt. So what takes place in this passage? The lesson opens at chapter 8, verse 14. The writer begins with, Then the king turned. Solomon turned because he had been facing the temple where the priests could not stand and the Shekinah glory of the Lord had filled the temple. Keep in mind that this is a worship experience. God manifested God's self in a thick cloud and filled the house of the Lord. The priests couldn't stand. The glory of the Lord filled the house, and Solomon, along with all the people, are no doubt in amazement of the presence of God filling the temple. Solomon turned around and blessed all the assembly of Israel. Townsend commentary notes that Solomon's blessing, the quote-unquote blessing of the people, is a loose use of the word, since it was typically priests, not kings, who were authorized to pronounce a blessing on the people. Townsend continues, Solomon was really expressing a blessing to the Lord. In verse 15, Solomon offers praise to God. Again, this is a worship experience. Solomon declares the Lord God of Israel to be blessed and declares that God, with God's hand or power, has fulfilled what God promised to his father, David. Solomon knows that God keeps God's promises. Even though God made the promise to Solomon's father, and even though it took many years to fulfill, God is still a promise keeper. In verse 16, Solomon recalls the words of God spoken to his father David. Solomon tells the gathered assembly how God had chosen a city from the tribes of Israel since God brought them out. God had not chosen a city from the tribes of Israel since God brought them out of Egypt. But when God chose David to be over his people, things changed. A commentary on the Holy Scriptures by John Peter Lange et al. Explains, after he had chosen David to be king and brought his people by him to the full and quiet possession of the promised land, it was fitting that he, as well as the nation, should have an abiding dwelling place. In verse 17, Solomon reminds the assembly how his father David had it in his mind to build a house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. Solomon is reminding them of his father's heart's desire. King David's heart was in the right place. He had good intentions to honor and glorify God's name with a permanent house. In verses 18 and 19, Solomon recalls how the Lord acknowledged God's intentions, but nevertheless denied David's desire. Solomon is recalling the history that has led them up to that present moment. Solomon wants them to know that this is the Lord's doing. And it didn't just start with him. It started many years ago with a king who was a man after God's own heart. In verse 20, Solomon declares that the Lord has kept the promise and that he has fulfilled his part to build God's house. Solomon has risen in the place of his father. He now sits on the throne of Israel, and he has built the house of the Lord his father desired. David dreamed the dream, and it was David's heart's desire. But his son Solomon is the one who completes the dream. This lesson closes at verse 21 with Solomon proclaiming that he has provided a place for the ark. It is, in fact, a magnificent place. The ark Solomon puts in this magnificent place represents the covenant of the Lord that God made with Solomon's ancestors. He's essentially saying, this has been a long journey, a journey all the way from when God brought us out of Egypt. But God is here now, and this is where God belongs. So let's give the text some context. Fidelity is defined as faithfulness to a person, cause, or belief demonstrated by continuing loyalty and support. I think the operative term in this definition is demonstrated by. Faithfulness must be demonstrated second by second, minute by minute, hour by hour, day, week, month, and year. God demonstrates God's faithfulness to God's people. Solomon understood and recognized God's fidelity. God is a promise keeper. The promise may have been made to his father, King David, but it was through Solomon that the promise would be kept. God honors God's covenants, and God keeps God's promises. Key words, not necessarily in the text, but good for discussion. The first would be omnipresent, and the second would be the Jerusalem temple. Omnipresent is defined as God as an infinite spirit being everywhere present in the cosmos. And you can check Psalm 139, verses 7 through 10, and Jeremiah 23, verses 23 and 24. And then a definition of the Jerusalem temple. It is defined as the structure in Jerusalem that was the center of worship and the national life of Israel from the 10th century before Christ, when it was built by Solomon, until its destruction by Rome in AD 70. It was rebuilt twice and had 3 periods, during which the temples of Solomon, Zerubbabel, and Herod stood. Themes, topics, discussion, or sermon preparation ideas. 1 might be a promise-keeping God. God is a promise-keeping God, and you can work with that. And then a second might be complete and wholehearted devotion. That's one way to define dedication. Complete and wholehearted devotion. And a question you might ask your listeners. Solomon dedicates the new temple to God. What can we personally dedicate to God? Now for the preview of next week's lesson. Next week we continue in the same chapter and pick up where we left off, as we continue studying Unit 2's theme of dedicating the temple of God. We see the second part of what Solomon has to say as he addresses the assembly of Israel. Next week, Solomon's prayer of dedication links the Davidic covenant and the covenant at Mount Sinai. The lesson is titled Solomon's Dedication Prayer, and Solomon seeks God's blessing. The text is taken from 1 Kings, the 8th chapter, verses 22 through 30, and then skips to verses 52 and 53. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I am Reverend Dexter Alexander, and you've been listening to SundaySchoolPreacher.com. If you want to support this channel, I accept correspondence and gifts at 1590 Jonesboro Road Southeast, Box 150032, Atlanta, Georgia 30315. Again, the only way I know this is helpful is if you subscribe, click the like button, or say so in the comments. Please also click the notifications bell so you'll be notified as soon as I upload next week's lesson. And if you don't mind, please share this site with other Sunday school teachers, preachers, and students. Thank you, and may God bless you real good.